It was the 1970s and 1980s, and a wave of home invasions and violent crimes were terrorizing California. Authorities would come to link many of these incidents and dub the perpetrator the East Area Rapist. But it wasn't until decades later that he would finally be caught, and it would take one of the most innovative uses of forensic science ever seen to get the upper hand on him. This is the true story of the Golden State Killer. It all started on June 5, 1974. A couple in their early 20s, Rian and Katie Majori, had been dating for several months and had just moved in together. They lived in a small town called Rancho Cordova, California, near Sacramento. On this night, they were watching TV in their living room when they heard someone trying to break into their house by prying open a window. Brian went to investigate and saw a man outside. He yelled at him to leave, and even though the intruder ran off, the two lovers were understandably shaken up. But that same routine would be repeated again 3 months later, on September 13, 1974. And this time, the intruder actually got in. According to what Katie told police, a man wearing a ski mask and dark clothing entered the house while she was taking a shower. She screamed, and he told her to be quiet. He then bound her wrists with electrical cord and taped her mouth shut with what felt like duct tape. After raping her, he fled. What made this particularly horrible was that it wasn't the first time something like this happened to Katie. 3 weeks prior to this attack, she had been out walking with her friend in the evening when a stranger grabbed her from behind, shoved her into his car, and drove her to an isolated area where he assaulted her. She managed to escape and run away, but was too traumatized to report it. So when it happened again, she did come forward to the police. This attack was different, however. Not only was the victim now in the safety of her own home, but the attacker had left behind some physical evidence. The police found some hairs from the intruder on the woman's body and on the bed. And despite the fact that it was only a few short years after the start of the serial killer craze, and the public was hungry for more, this case was effectively put on the back burner, as the resources just weren't available to do anything about it. Then in February 1976, there was another attack in the area. This time it was a young mother named Linda Joanne Cool. She had been alone in her house when a man broke in, tied her up, and raped her. Later, he would become known as the Visalia Rapist. And with the help of a composite sketch, the police were able to link 12 attacks between 1974 and 1976 to the same individual. Not only did the assailants seem to be targeting women in their 20s, but they had all been tied up in similar ways, usually with electrical cords. And although the victims' descriptions of the perp varied, the general consensus was that he was a white male, 5'9", with a muscular build, aged between 25 and 35. But the problem was, nobody was able to provide any concrete evidence that could lead to an arrest. In the early days, police relied heavily on witness testimony and physical evidence, like fingerprints or DNA, but DNA profiling wouldn't be invented for another decade. And even then, it was still mostly used to exclude suspects rather than identify them. Police were stuck in the era of Sherlock Holmes, and forensics was essentially limited to dusting for fingerprints and hopefully getting a good description of the perp. So it's no surprise that the case went cold after all those leads dried up. What's surprising is that it didn't stay that way. You see, over the next few years, the focus shifted to the Golden State. On Christmas Eve 1974, a couple in Santa Barbara County were awoken in their home by sounds of breaking glass. When they turned on the lights, they saw a shadowy figure rummaging through their belongings. The man grabbed his 35mm camera and tried to snap a few pictures of the burglar. He got off one shot before the flash went off, and the intruder noticed him. The criminal then took off down the street, but not before taking the camera with him. This would be the first of many burglaries in the area that the police would later link to the Visalia Rapist. All the homes targeted were occupied, but the burglaries happened at random with no discernible pattern, except that the perp seemed to target cameras and film. In August 1976, the residents of one of the homes returned from vacation to find that they'd been robbed. But there was something strange about this crime scene. As well as the usual stuff being stolen, the burglar had brought his own furniture into the house and proceeded to trash the place. He also wrote messages on the walls with lipstick. The police identified the lipstick as belonging to a pharmacy in Ventura, where surveillance footage showed a man buying it, paying for it with cash. Even worse, the pharmacy was only 10 miles away from the previous scene of the crime. Was this the same guy? As more and more burglaries like this happened, it became clear that the police were dealing with something special. Many of the houses hit were in Orange County, so the media began calling this person the Orange County burglar. Strangely, though, he never touched the valuables that were plainly in sight, preferring instead to destroy the places and leave with cheap items like candles, records, and magazines. However, what really set this criminal apart was the DNA left behind at the scenes. Underneath one of the beds in a ransacked bedroom, a pair of footprints were discovered. And although they couldn't be matched to any known criminals, they were taken to a lab and kept on file. Years passed, and the burglaries continued to happen all over California. It seemed to the police that the only thing connecting these crimes was the fact that the perp liked to write cryptic messages on the walls. Things like "Beware of dog," or "I was always late," which seemed to be some kind of signature. In total, the police would link 13 burglaries, 5 murders, and 12 rapes to this man, who they eventually dubbed the East Area Rapist. But it wasn't until 2016 that he was finally given a name and a face. You see, the detectives working the case never stopped believing that the key to catching the Golden State Killer lay in the crime scene evidence, specifically the footprints. With new techniques and equipment, they were able to make a mold of the shoe print and compare it with thousands of other crime scenes. No matches were found, but they did notice something interesting. The shoe print looked similar to another case from 1977. This was a murder in Santa Barbara, and the victim was a young girl named Jan Christina. But the similarities in the shoe prints were too much to ignore. Could this be the same guy? After looking into it further, it was revealed that he had committed the burglary 2 weeks after the murder, which he had committed during a botched rape attempt. However, there was one key piece of evidence that was missing: the DNA evidence from the footprint. But fortunately, the police were able to get their hands on some of the dirt from the sole of the shoe and send it to a lab. There, the DNA was extracted from the soil particles and compared to the DNA from the Visalia rapist. Voila, match. The police were ecstatic, but they needed to find someone that matched the profile of the mysterious killer so they could continue their investigation. To do this, they combed through all the databases of convicted criminals and compared their DNA to the Golden State Killer's DNA. Nothing to the untrained eye. This would look like a dead end, but the police weren't done yet. They turned to something they had in abundance: hair. Back in the day when the police had little else to work with, they collected hair samples from every single crime scene and stored them away. The problem was that none of them contained roots, which would have made it easier to extract DNA. But if the scientists could just get their hands on some, they might have a chance. Fortunately, one of the people who worked in the lab knew just the thing. She reached out to a service called GEDmatch, which allowed users to upload their DNA profiles and see how closely they were related to other people with accounts. By comparing the DNA profile of the Golden State Killer to people who had uploaded their own, they were able to create a family tree of sorts, a rough estimate of where the killer's DNA might have come from. GEDmatch gave them Joseph James D'Angelo, a 53-year-old former police officer. And if you thought that this was the end, well, think again. Just to be sure, the police obtained a discarded pizza crust from his trash, got a warrant to test it, and boom, DNA match. Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested in 2018 and has since been sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences without parole. His crimes shocked the nation and proved that a serial killer could strike fear into the hearts of millions. It also showed the power of genetic genealogy, which has since been used to solve hundreds of cold cases. And for the victims and their families, it provided a kind of closure that they never thought they would get.